Hey all, Ron here from Military Images with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. A couple days ago, I had a request from one of our viewers, Robert Schultz. Robert said, I love hearing about the regular Army, but is there any information on the regular Marines? Short answer is yes. I dug through my previous research and profiles and other stories that I've written, and I thought the best way to capture the story of the Marines during the Civil War is to tell the story of one particular Marine. And to get to the story, oh, by the way, he's pictured here. And before we get to the meat of the story, let me set it up for you. I want to take you back to Fort Sumter in the summer of 1863. Union warships and batteries had targeted the fort, really making an impressive effort to try to take it, to try to destroy the fort. Confederate garrison occupying it and hammered away, pounded it through the summer months of 1863. Massive bombardment. The symbol of Southern resistance at Fort Sumter still stood, but it was pretty much a smoking ruins of a place. In fact, one U.S. Navy officer had to say Sumter was now, in fact, nothing but an outpost to be held by the enemy as a matter of pride. Still, there was certainly strategic, iconic value to the fort. Now, to add to the woes of the Confederate forces, two of the defensive positions in the chain surrounding Fort Sumter and Charleston Harbor had been occupied in around September 17th, 1863. That's Fort Wagner and Battery Gregg. The Rear Admiral of the Union Navy in charge, John Dahlgren, decided to take a chance and send a mission to land on Fort Sumter and try to take the fort by force. So he called for volunteers, and he had about 400 men who volunteered altogether, something around 133 Marines, and the rest of them were sailors. One of those Marines is the man pictured here. He's 23-year-old Marine Lieutenant Charles Henry Bradford, native of Portland, Maine. He was by nature sort of an introvert. He was still one of the earliest to enlist after the original bombardment of Fort Sumter in April 1861. At that time, he joined the 1st Maine Infantry, his home state's 1st Infantry Regiment, and stayed in the regiment for 3 months, serving out his enlistment. And then he takes an officer's examination for the Marines. He passes, and now he's a lieutenant. That's in the fall of 1861. Less than 2 years later, in August of 1863, he is in New York and he receives orders to join the Marine Battalion, which is then in South Carolina. By that time, he was detailed as battalion quartermaster and advanced in rank from 2nd lieutenant to 1st lieutenant. So he was proving a good and valuable officer. Anyway, back to September 7th in Dahlgren, he forms this group of volunteers to attack. Late that night, around 10 o'clock or so, these 400 Marines and sailors embark in about 25 rowboats, and they set out towards Fort Sumter. If you've ever been there, you know there's not much land surrounding the fort. So whatever ground they hit, there's very little of it, and is surrounded at this particular time, the rubble of the fort is strewn all over the place. Still, there's some sense that the Confederate garrison and the fort has been weakened, and they might have a chance of victory. About midnight, the ships are getting close, extreme darkness are set. At this point, the boats had been towed in about 800 yards from the fort. Then the rowboats take off. They go towards their target. Inside Fort Sumter, meanwhile, the Confederate garrisons, about 200 defenders, they got word of the attack. And about 1 o'clock, they start getting ready because they see the ships coming in. They see the rowboats beginning to move out. They're ready. The Confederates are ready. When when Bradford and the other Marines land, they come under heavy attack, shelling, guns, the equivalent of sort of hand grenades, whatever they can, rocks, whatever they can throw down on these advancing Marines and sailors, they do it. Long story short, the Union forces do not win the day. The Confederates win, or I should say, win the night. The Confederates win. And when it's all over, though Fort Sumter is crumbled, it still stands, and the Confederate flag is still flying over it. Confederates are going outside afterwards, and they find a wounded Marine, a Marine officer, laying on the rocks in front of the fort. And of course, that's Bradford. They bring him inside the fort, and he's badly wounded. He's been shot in the groin. This is not a good injury at any time, but particularly during the Civil War. He's brought inside the fort, and he makes an unusual request. He asks for a local man, a local doctor in Charleston named Albert Gallatin Mackey to assist him. Now, you got to wonder, why would Lieutenant Bradford, the Marine, ask for a local Charleston doctor? Well, here's the backstory. Bradford's father was a Mason, and when Bradford went off to Charleston, his father said, if something bad happens to you, if you are wounded, I'm a Mason, and so you're entitled to the services of my fellow Masons. So if something bad, if some calamity befalls you, I want you to contact Dr. Mackey, and he will help you. He has to, because he's a Mason. Now, Mackey had written and published extensively about Freemasonry and was well known to fraternal brothers on both sides, North and South. So although Bradford's father probably did not know Mackey personally, he knew his name. He knew they had written the book. And so the Confederate officers who were attending to Bradford pass along the message to Dr. Mackey, and Mackey comes to the hospital to help treat the severely and seriously wounded Bradford. Mackey does his best, but it's not enough. Bradford succumbs to his wound on September 23rd. That's about 2 weeks after he's wounded. Mackey gets all the personal effects and sends it home to the family. Meanwhile, Dr. Mackey arranges a funeral for Bradford's remains and has him buried in the Masonic section of Charleston's Magnolia Cemetery. Now, this creates consternation among Charleston residents because the idea of a Yankee, the idea of a Union officer being buried in their cemetery is too much to bear. There's arguments, there's debate, and in the end, Dr. Mackey is forced, he's intimidated really, to have Bradford's body disinterred and moved to Potter's Field, which for those of you who are not students of 19th century terminology, Potter's Field is basically the place where paupers and others who can't afford a burial are laid to rest. So that's where the whole thing sits as of September of 1863. Now, flash forward to February 18th, 1865. Charleston falls to Union forces, and after that happens, Rear Admiral John Dahlgren becomes aware of what had happened to Bradford's body, that it had been buried in Potter's Field. And here's a quote from Dahlgren. He says, With an inhumanity disgraceful to any cause, his remains, Bradford, were compulsorily exhumed and carried to the potter's field. Dahlgren is enraged, and he writes an order on March 15th. He says he's determined to put the mark of reprobation on this barbarous act. I desire to restore the body to the resting place where, through the kindness of a friend, Dr. Mackey, it was originally placed. So the next morning, March 16th, 1865, the body of Bradford is exhumed from Potter's Field and brought under honor guard to St. Paul's Church in the city by a detachment of the 144th New York Infantry. A large congregation of officers and men from the Navy and the Army and the Marines are all there. They listen to a sermon delivered by one of the Navy's chaplains. After the funeral, the remains are carried outside to a waiting hearse. Dahlgren and other senior officers, all the top brass are there. They line up behind Bradford's remains in the hearse, and the entire procession makes their way to the gravesite, the original gravesite chosen by Dr. Mackey, followed by this large concourse of Marines, sailors, soldiers, and Union loyal citizens. Bradford is laid to rest for the third time in 2 years. And of course, the volleys are fired by the Marines, the traditional honorarium to those who have fallen at the end of the ceremony. There's one more, there's sort of an epilogue to all this. Years later, in 1873, military officials in Washington ordered the remains of Bradford and other Union soldiers and sailors disinterred and moved to the new National Military Cemetery in Florence, South Carolina. Now, these military transfers, cemetery transfers, were accomplished between April and May of 1873. Now, if you go and search the records of the Florence National Cemetery, you will not find any record for Bradford. What happened? I don't know. Was there a clerical error? Was there some accidental mishap? Was the grave somehow not marked properly and the records were lost? Was it possibly the mischievous work of somebody else? We just don't know. I haven't been able to find what exactly happened, but I can tell you, I've even walked. I went to Florence and walked the cemetery and could not find the grave. So that's where this ends. That's where the story ends. Bradford's body remains missing to this day, and would love to be able to find where this Marine is buried, what happened to him. It's still a mystery. So that's it. That's today's story, and we'll be back with a new episode tomorrow. Until then, take care.